Good morning. My name is Harriet Tubman. I was born a slave in Dorset County, Maryland, around 1820. I was about 5 or 6 years old when I started working as a house servant. Then about 7 years later, I was sent to the fields to work. While I was in my teens, I suffered a serious injury when a foreman threw a heavy object at one of the other workers and it hit me instead. I suffered with sleeping spells after that for the rest of my life. Around 1844, I married a black man named John Tubman. I changed my name from Arameda Ross and later my first name to Harriet, after my mother. In 1849, when I was about 29, other slaves and I were afraid that we were to be sold. So I resolved to run away. I followed the North Star at night, eventually reaching Philadelphia. I worked and saved some money so I could go back to Maryland to get my sister and 2 children. On my second trip back, I rescued my brother and 2 others. Then I went back for my husband, but he had remarried, so I brought back other slaves. I made several trips back, sometimes using my master's horse and buggy. By 1856, my capture would have brought a $40,000 reward. It was a dangerous time when I went back for my parents. I figured that I brought freedom to about 300 slaves. Frederick Douglass pointed out that I never lost a passenger as a conductor. John Brown said I was one of the bravest people on the continent. I worked during the Civil War in the Union as a cook, a nurse, and even a spy. Later, I settled at the end of a long life in 1913 in Auburn, New York. Thank you for listening.
The part I'm about to read was actually researched and written by Sue Parks, but she has a really painful knee injury and couldn't be here today, so I'm reading her character. I'm Cathay Williams, and I was the first African-American woman to enlist and serve in the United States Army, posing as a man under the name William Cathay. I was born in 1844 in Independence, Missouri, to a free man and a woman in slavery, making my legal status that of a slave. During my adolescence, I worked as a house slave on the Johnson plantation in the outskirts of Jefferson City, Missouri. In 1861, Union forces occupied Jefferson City in the early stages of the Civil War. At that time, captured slaves were officially designated by the Union as contraband, and many were forced to serve in military support roles such as cooks, laundresses, or nurses. At age 17, I was pressed into serving the 8th Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment. I traveled with the Army throughout the South. After briefly working as a cook in Louisiana, I was placed in the service of General Philip Sheridan. Under his charge, I experienced life on the front lines as his troops marched on the Shenandoah Valley. In my time as an Army servant, I witnessed several battles and watched soldiers burn cotton fields and a Confederate gunboat in the Red River at Shreveport, Louisiana. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Congress developed the first all-black military unit, which later became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. I wanted to be one of them. I traveled to St. Louis in 1866 and joined the Army under the guise of a man. Women were not allowed to be in the Army at that time, although some had secretly fought in the Civil War. Prospects for black women at the time were grim, and because of my familiarity with Army routine, posing as a man in the Army offered me relatively secure existence. When I registered for the 38th Infantry Regiment, I used the alias William Cathay. My enlistment papers indicate that a medical exam determined my fitness for duty and gave my age as 22. Within my unit, no one knew I was a woman except for my cousin and a close friend, both of whom guarded my secret with the utmost loyalty. While serving as a Buffalo soldier, I learned to use a musket and perform garrison duties, guard duty, and scouting missions. During my service in the Army, I spent time in 4 different post hospitals for various illnesses, including smallpox and rheumatism, but I was never found out. During an illness on October 14, 1868, I was honorably discharged by a surgeon who some people thought I had admitted my gender to. After my discharge, I returned to dressing as a woman and worked as a cook and a laundress, and I owned a boarding house. A St. Louis journalist recorded and published my story in my own words in 1875. In 1889, I was poor and ill and applied for veterans benefit and a pension, which I was denied. I died around 1893 at the age of 50. My grave location is unknown. People say I exemplified one of the ways in which oppressed people, whether impoverished black or both, found cunning ways to survive in a difficult period in history. I was a soldier.
I am Elizabeth Keckley, born Lizzie Hobbs, the child of slave parents. Therefore, I came upon the earth free in godlike thought, but fettered in action. I was my mother's only child. She was kind and forbearing, but our slave mistress was a hard taskmaster. As mother had so much work to do, I determined at a very young age to render her all the assistance in my power. And in doing so, my young energy was taxed to the utmost. I was strong, healthy, and capable from an early age, but our owner punished me by severe beatings and repeatedly told me I would never be worth my salt. I did not know much of my father. He belonged to another owner. He only was allowed to visit my mother twice a year. On her deathbed, my mother confessed that our master was my real father. When I was 14, I went to live with my master's son. He tried to subdue what he called my stubborn pride and rebellious spirit. His savage floggings were not the only things that brought me suffering and deep mortification. I was regarded as fair-looking, as they said, for one of my race. And for years, this white man had base designs on me. Suffice it to say, I became a mother in his persecution of me. This is the only child I ever brought into the world. If my poor boy ever suffered any humiliating pangs on account of his birth, he could not blame his mother, for God knows she did not wish to give him life. he must blame the edicts of that society, which deemed it no crime to undermine the virtue of girls in my then position. Years passed, and I lived with another master who moved to St. Louis, but did not have luck in growing his fortune there. But I worked and earned a reputation as a seamstress and dressmaker, with the best ladies in St. Louis as my patrons. I married a Mr. Keckley, who was a slave, not a free man, as he wanted me to believe. With sheer determination and a network of supporters in the social circles for whom I sewed, I was able to earn freedom for myself and my son George for $1,200 I paid to my master. In 1860, moving to Washington, D.C., I established my own dressmaking business and was soon styling the Washington elite for $2.50 a day. This was the highest paid opportunity women had in this time. My dresses became the envy of women because of their extraordinary fit and sophisticated style. They said I was elegant, upright, and appropriate, the Victorian ideal. I was treated like a black socialite in the African American community. In 1861, I met Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of the president. I became her personal dresser and confidant, her closest companion. We formed a special bond. While I was privy to the halls of power in the White House with access to the president, I had autonomy since I wasn't a servant and I didn't live at the White House. Mrs. Lincoln and I traveled together and raised money for the Civil War effort. My son George died in the war, but my mourning was cut short to comfort Mrs. Lincoln, who lost her own son to typhoid 6 months later. I lived a busy life during that time besides mourning and comforting. I found an organization with Frederick Douglass support to help newly freed slaves with housing, medical care, and basic necessities. If the white people can have festivals to raise funds for the relief of suffering soldiers, why should not the well-to-do colored people go to work to do something for the benefits of suffering people of our own race? I wrote my memoir in 1868, which included some of the First Lady's personal correspondence to me. I meant for my book to defend her reputation after she transitioned out of the White House, but it had the opposite effect. Mrs. Lincoln felt betrayed. It was a painful time for both of us. I wrote impassioned, apologetic letters to her, but never received a word in reply. To me, who she had called her closest friend. We never spoke again.
Good morning. My name is Harriet Jacobs. I was born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina. My father, Elijah Knox, and my mother, Delilah Hornblow, were property of different slave owners, but I lived with my parents until my mother's death. At 6, I was sent to live with my mother's mistress, Margaret Hornblow, and I was taught to read, write, and sew. When Miss Margaret died, her will was forged, and I was given to Dr. James Norcrum's daughter, Miss Mary Madeline. Even though I was but a child, Dr. James sexually plagued me. My young life became shrouded in avoiding the master at all costs. When I was but a teen, Dr. James forbade my marriage to a free black carpenter and sent me to live with my grandmother, Yellow Hornblow, who was a freed woman that worked as a baker. Even if he could have obtained permission to marry me while I was a slave, the marriage would give him no power to protect me from my master. And then, if we had children, I knew that we must follow the conditions of the mother. I entered into a liaison with future Congressman Samuel Sawyer. Mr. Sawyer and I had 2 children, Joseph and Louisa. I continued to fight off the advances of Master James, who threatened to sell my children for my disobedience. As punishment, he sent me to my son's plantation, where I was broken in to work the fields. I would rather drudge out my life on a cotton plantation till the grave opened to give me rest than to live with an unprincipled master. Once I ran away, and Master James had my brother John and my children jailed for months. Mr. Sawyer concocted a plan to have my family sold to traders and eventually took John to Washington, D.C. Although Mr. Sawyer purchased my children and gave them to Granny, because of the Nate Turner Rebellion, it was not possible for my children to ever be freed. I eventually made it back to Granny's, where I spent 7 years hiding in the attic, where I was unable to stand or sit comfortably. Finally, leaving my son and Granny behind, I escaped to Philadelphia. I was assisted in getting to New York City, where I was reunited with my brother, who had run away from Mr. Sawyer. I was reunited with Louisa, too, who was working as a maid. I was 29. A short time later, John and I moved to Rochester, New York. I became a confidant and friend of Quaker, anti-slavery, and women's rights activist Amy Post. My past life began to catch up with me following the congressional passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. Both me and my brother feared for our safety, as legally we were still escaped slaves. Dr. James even posted a $100 reward for my capture. I admit the black man is inferior, but what is it that makes him so? It's the ignorance of the white man which the white man compelled him to live. It is the torturing whip that lashes the manhood out of him. It is the fierce bloodhounds of the South and the scarcely less cruel human bloodhounds of the North who insist on enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law. After years of working as a nursemaid for Mr. Nathaniel Parker Willis, I was finally granted my freedom. Amy Post urged me to write the story of my life to aid the anti-slavery cause. And in 1860, the publication of Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl was complete. My brother promoted a British edition of Incident abroad. My story was the first narrative of a female fugitive slave in the United States and would be the only narrative to focus on the sexual oppression of slave women. I continued my work after the Civil War. I devoted myself to relief efforts of former slaves. With my daughter, I founded a school in Alexandria, Virginia, and raised funds in England for a home for women and children in Savannah, Georgia. I also worked actively in Edenton, promoting the welfare of ex-slaves. I finally returned with my daughter to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and opened a boarding house there. I passed away at the age of 84 on March 7th, 1897.
Escaping from slavery. Most runaway slaves fled to freedom in the dead of night, often pursued by slave catchers and barking bloodhounds. A few fugitives devised clever ruses or stowed away on ships and wagons. My name is Ellen Kraft. My husband William and I are best known for making our escape from slavery by traveling in first-class trains, dining with steamboat captains, and staying in the best hotels. Despite the luxury accommodations, our escape from Georgia to Philadelphia was filled with heart-stopping moments and narrow escapes that could have led to our discovery and capture. I was born in Clinton, Georgia in 1826 to a biracial slave woman and her white master. As a child, I was so light-skinned that I was frequently mistaken for a member of my father's white family, ensuring the displeasure of the plantation's mistress. When I was 11 years old, the mistress sent me to Macon, Georgia, to her daughter as a wedding gift to serve as a lady's maid. It was in Macon that I later met and fell in love with my future husband, William Kraft. William was put up for auction at the age of 16 to help settle his master's gambling debts and became the property of a local banker. Minutes before being sold, William witnessed the sale of his terrified 14-year-old sister. His parents and brothers had met the same fate and were scattered throughout the state. William and I were given permission to marry in 1846, but because we belonged to different masters, we were not permitted to live together. William was a skilled cabinet maker, and although his new master collected most of his earnings, he was able to keep some of his earnings, which he saved and came in handy later. Both of us, having experienced such brutal family separations, despaired over having children, fearing that they would be torn from us. We endured living separately for a time, but we longed to be together, to have a family, a normal life, and so we began to plan our escape from slavery. We determined that we could not hope to make a successful escape on foot due to the great distance involved. My husband actually came up with a plan to hide in plain sight, traveling by train or other public transportation. However, I had to disguise myself as a wealthy, young, white master traveling with his slave. It became clear that the success or failure of our plan totally depended on my ability to mask my race, my gender, and my social status. It almost overwhelmed me. I wrapped my face in bandages and put my writing arm in a sling. Slaves could not read or write, so the sling stopped clerks or authorities from expecting me to sign documents. I cut my hair short, put on men's clothing, and donned a pair of green eyeglasses and a top hat. It was December 21st, 1848, and our journey north to freedom had begun. The journey was fraught with breathless moments and close calls. For example, after purchasing tickets to Savannah at the Macon train station, I went to my assigned car. William went to the Negro car, where he spotted the owner of the cabinet-making shop where he had worked on the train platform. The man began peering through windows of the cars. William's William turned his face away from the window, and expecting the worst, he shrank down in his seat. The man searched the car that I was in, but never gave the bandaged invalid a second glance. Just as we approached William's car, the bell clanged and the train lurched off. There were many times that I almost lost hope, but the worst was when we reached Maryland. Baltimore was the last major stop before the free state of Pennsylvania. It had a vigilant border patrol. William and I were detained, asked to leave the train and report to authorities for verification of ownership. The officer refused to let us go. I felt overwhelmed with misery, but continued to pray silently as the officer stood his ground. Suddenly, the departure bell rang. The officer looked at my bandages and invalid's disguise, again saying to the clerk, "He's not well. It's a pity to stop him. Tell the conductor to let this gentleman and slave pass." We arrived in Philadelphia the next day. It was Christmas morning. William and I were safe at last. There we were given assistance by the Underground Abolitionist Network and moved to Boston. William resumed work as a cabinet maker, and I continued to develop my skills as a seamstress. In 1850, we were forced to flee to England because of attempts to return us to slavery by means of the Fugitive Slave Act. We lived there for 20 years, continued our education, and wrote a book, Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom. Eventually, we had 5 children, the family we had always wanted. In the 1870s, we returned to the United States, where we opened an industrial school for colored youth near Savannah, Georgia. I passed away in 1897, and at my request was buried under my favorite tree on the Georgia plantation where I was born.
Please rise now in body or spirit and join in singing our closing hymn, number 153,